Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on our webinar. Before we get started, I would like to take a few minutes to explain how to use the GoToWebinar technology. In particular, I'm going to show you some of the features that will allow us to make our presentation more interactive. You should see the control pane pictured on your screen right now. If you don't, it's because it has been minimized, and you can pull it back out by going to the Grab tab, B, which hides and shows the control panel. There is also an attendee list where you can see all of the participants on the call. For today's webinar, we will open up the lines for questions and discussions at the end of the webinar. At that time, you can raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon on your control panel, and I will unmute your line. Alternatively, you can type your question into the question pane, and I will read it to the group or respond privately. All of the panes can be expanded or minimized by clicking on the plus or minus buttons that are at the top left of each pane. If for some reason at the end of the webinar you're having trouble with your audio, make sure you're not muted on your personal phone and that you have entered in the audio pin that is provided at the beginning of the call.
Thank you, Allison. Hi, my name is Lori Haycock, and I'm the Acting National Director of Data Coaching and Analytics for Achieving the Dream. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Data Insight webinar series. Today's topic is on leading and lagging indicators. Allison is the one driving and who walked you through the information on how to raise your hand and ask questions and work the audio. If you have any problems during the webinar, please just enter a question in the chat frame. Our presenter today is Dr. Brad Phillips. He's an Achieving the Dream Data Coach, as well as the President and Chief Executive Officer for the Institute for Evidence-Based Change, and we're delighted to have Brad joining us today. So we're going to quickly review just an overview of our webinar series. Brad will do his presentation on leading and lagging indicators, and we'll have time for you to have a question and answer session with us, and then there'll be a brief evaluation. So we try to offer these webinar series about every 6 weeks. We encourage you, we advertise them via email and through our newsletter. We encourage you to follow Achieving the Dream at Achieve the Dream and to join the conversation regarding data using hashtag ATD_data. All of our webinars, including today's, are recorded and are available for viewing on demand on our Achieving the Dream YouTube channel. If you are interested in a particular topic or you would like to be a presenter, please contact Allison Acaluno at the email address shown. Okay, stay tuned for our upcoming webinars. All right, before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll to see who we have on the line with us and the roles that you play at your institution.
So if you would, you should see something on your end for the poll. Go ahead and select whether or not you're a faculty, administrator, researcher, an ATD data or leadership coach, or something else. Give it just a few more seconds for everyone to pull in. Great. Let's see who we have. So on your end, you should see the results of the poll. It looks like we have mostly researchers and administrators. So great. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Brad for the feature presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lori. I hope everyone can hear me. And as I was on hold, my line went dead, so I'm really glad I was able to call back in and begin the webinar. My name is Brad Phillips, and I direct the Institute for Evidence-Based Change. As a data coach, I work with a number of colleges, primarily in Texas and in Illinois. And a lot of our work with the Institute for Evidence-Based Change is around data use. So I'd like to talk to you today about leading and lagging indicators and the importance of those. And I want to thank everyone. I know everyone is really busy. The beginning of the semester is always a little bit crazy, and I sincerely hope that you find this webinar useful and immediately applicable to your work. So as we think about the learning objectives on the next slide, what we're hoping to complete today is understanding the concept of what we really mean by a leading and lagging indicator, as well as how these indicators can be helpful and be identified specifically for your work in your role, and what kinds of leading indicators can be used directly in your work. Because what we find is when we focus on leading indicators, it helps us to understand more about what our students are doing, how they're performing, and what happens to them in terms of the kind of outcomes that we generally talk about. But on the next slide, let's talk a little bit about what we're all faced with. And I saw that most of us are researchers on the call, but we also have a few administrators as well. And this slide is meant to convey that we have way too many indicators. Those of us that are tracking Achieving the Dream indicators, we're also tracking IPEDs, accountability indicators, whether those are state level, local level, or national level. We may be participating in a benchmarking project. We also may be conducting program review. And there are so many indicators out there, it's difficult to determine what we should focus on and what's the most important. So on the next slide, what we're trying to get at is using leading indicators to help us focus on what really matters, and to create this path to focus on just a few key indicators, because these leading indicators actually influence our lagging indicators. And we know that with everything we're doing in the community colleges, focus is so critical. We work with a number of colleges, not only with Achieving the Dream, but also outside of Achieving the Dream, and they're really going crazy with what do I track? But if we focus on our leading indicators, we find that these are powerful indicators that help us really understand what's happening to our students. So let's talk about what leading indicators are on the next slide. These leading and lagging indicators are borrowed from the field of economics and business. You may have heard, especially recently as we're listening to debates, that we have a number of leading indicators that deal with economic kinds of things. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But leading indicators tend to be indicators that are in your control, and they lead to your hoped-for success. Lagging indicators are affected by what you do to influence your leading indicators. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to some other slides. So let's move on to the next one. When we think about business and economic leading indicators, one of the things that we hear about in the news are things like manufacturing orders are up. I'm sorry, I just lost the slides. There we go. Thank you. So when we hear about new manufacturer orders, people in economics get really excited. We hear about new building permits for new homes. Well, what does that mean? That folks are now going to be going to Home Depot and buying lots of things for those new homes. We hear about other leading indicators such as weekly jobless claims, and of course that those claims are going down. That gets folks who care about economic issues very excited because they know that lagging indicators are going to be influenced. What we find are lagging indicators are things like prime rate that's charged by banks. So when the economy is getting better, what happens to those prime rates? They go up. In fact, you may have heard that the Fed is coming together right now to talk about changing interest rates because the economy is getting better. We also learn about things in lagging indicators such as the consumer price index, that is, how much things cost. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about the relationship of these indicators and how they might work in the community college system. So what we find is that there's not necessarily just one leading indicator that affects a lagging indicator, that there may be a multitude of leading indicators that affect some lagging indicator. So what might that look like? Let's move on to the next slide. And let's personalize this a little bit. So let's use leading and lagging indicators for our own life. Let's say we are really focused on having a good day. So here's a webinar that I have to do today, and I want to make sure that I'm going to have a good day and I'm prepared, right? That's my lagging indicator, that I have a good day. But a leading indicator is what actually influences whether I'm going to have that good day. So one, did I sleep well? And in fact, luckily I did. The puppy did not bother me last night. Did I have a good breakfast? Absolutely. So by fueling up and sleeping well, I know I'm better prepared for a good day. Was I out of the house on time? I was actually early. So I know that I'm well prepared to be successful in my day. Now, let's personalize this and move it over to community colleges. We also know that leading indicators could build on one another. So we have one indicator that then influences another leading indicator that influences another and then moves towards a lagging indicator. So let's take a look at what that would look like in our world. Next slide. So let's take a look at a lagging indicator of certificate, degree, and transfer completion. So essentially, we are all concerned about completion. We know that completion matters a great deal in students' lives. We look at the data by Tony Carnevale at Georgetown and how students with some college and community college completion on their transcripts tend to earn more money. But how do we influence certificate, degrees, and transfer? For one, we know it's very difficult to directly influence increasing degrees, certificates, and having more students transfer, because we can't directly change that. About the only thing that we can do to improve certificates and degrees directly is to maybe have a software program that alerts students when they're close to a degree. So rather than petitioning for a degree, we can have a software program that says, look, student, you are 2 courses away or 3 courses away. Transfer, we tend to be a bit of a victim of our transfer institutions and so forth. So there's not much that an institution can do to directly influence that. But when we think about lagging indicators, let's go back to the last slide, please. When we think about lagging or leading indicators, let's talk about what influences whether or not a student completes achieving a certificate, degree, or transfer. The first is we know that many students begin in remedial courses. And we know that remedial courses can be the black hole of our community college system. That students start in a level of remediation, developmental ed, basic skills, whatever it's called at your institution, and they never get out. But if they complete that remedial course, then they are set up to engage in college-level courses. So in terms of a leading indicator, we're looking for completion rates on remedial courses, because when they complete, they tend to now move on to college-level courses. Once they're in college-level courses, we're looking at completion rates in college-level courses, because if they complete college-level courses, they tend to persist. They're obviously earning units or credits. And then if we look at complete major or sequences within that major, then they are getting close to and achieving certificate, degrees, and transfer eligibility. So when we think of leading indicators and lagging indicators, as researchers, as administrators, as faculty, what we want to look at specifically with all the different measures is what % of our students are completing remedial courses. Of those, what % are moving into and completing college-level courses, and then moving into completing major course sequences, because that will influence whether or not students receive degrees, certificates, and transfers. I'm working with a college right now that has really gotten this concept down well, Odessa College in West Texas. And Odessa is a college that I write a great deal about in articles in things like Huffington Post and so forth. Let's stay on the slide. Thank you. And one of the things that is amazing about Odessa College is they got the idea that, look, if we can keep students just in class, because we know that every student wants to be successful in that class and stay in that class, then by staying in that class, success breeds success as students are successful and then move on throughout one course to the next course. And in fact, they didn't focus at all on graduation. No completion focus at all. They simply focused on those leading indicators of whether or not a student is retained or earns a successful grade in class. Now, what happened? Over 3 years' time, their retention rates went up to 96%. Now, all of us would love to have retention rates of 96%. In addition, their course completion rates went up to 77%, which is extremely high. National averages are around 66%. And in fact, their graduation rate went up 55%. So they chose not to focus on graduation, but as a result of focusing on a leading indicator of retention in the class and course success, they were able to influence their graduation rates. Okay, let's move on. As I said earlier, you may have leading indicators that affect one another, but you also may have leading indicators that are not necessarily one after the other. They may be different influences. So on the next slide, let's take a look at how that looks. And this is primarily for the lens of a faculty member. So for example, a faculty member is going to very much care about, in terms of what their schema is about leading indicators, whether or not a student shows up for class. Faculty members can also tell you that if a student shows up in class, they didn't bring a pen, they didn't bring a pencil, they didn't bring their book, they're likely not going to be very successful. But if they show up for class, and they show up for class, they also work and pass their exams and turn in their assignments, and they also complete a major capstone project, which may have a large weight on their grade, they're likely to reach the lagging indicator of completing that course successfully. So from the lens of a faculty member, their leading indicators are directly related to what's happening in their classroom. Are students showing up? Are they passing exams? Are they turning in major assignments? From there, they have a lagging indicator of a successful course grade. Okay, moving on. Now, as you can imagine, leading and lagging indicators depend on your view, that is your role, where you sit. We talked about a faculty member, and you'll see our faculty member on the left. They care about what we talked about in terms of showing up for class, turning assignments, and so forth. But a college president may care about different leading and lagging indicators than a faculty member. So the thing to remember is that perspective matters. So when we're presenting data or reviewing data, depending on our role, we may view indicators very differently as to whether they're leading or lagging. From a faculty member perspective, they may not care about graduation rates per se because they're very focused on students being successful in their classroom. A college president cares deeply about things like graduation rates and transfer rates and so forth. So it's not that either one doesn't care about what the other one cares about, but in terms of perspective, when data is being presented, it's always important to ensure that that data focuses on what they care about. And when we say care about, what we mean by that is what they have influence over. So let's move on to the next slide, and we're going to do a little test here. So I'd like you all at your computers to make a guess on whether this is a leading or lagging indicator. So let's start with the next slide, and let's say 78% of our students who earn degrees are employed in their field within 2 years of graduation. Now my question to you, is this a leading indicator or a lagging indicator? Let's move on. What's your answer? It's obviously a lagging indicator. Okay, I gave you a very easy one, right? This is very difficult for us to influence, right? We would have to think about what leading indicators would get to whether or not our students who receive degrees are employed in their field within 2 years of graduation. Yet, we have this indicator that we are all responsible for in things like ability to benefit. But we have to focus on what those leading indicators might be that lead up to whether or not a student graduates and then is employed. Okay, let's start with another one. 72% of our students persist from their first term to a second term. Now, I'd like you to view this as if you were a vice president of instruction. So if you're a vice president of instruction, is this a leading or a lagging indicator? Okay, next slide. It's a leading indicator because as a vice president of instruction, we need students to persist in order for them to get to completing their majors, receiving certificates, and graduating. So remember, perspective really matters when we think about leading and lagging indicators. Okay, next slide. All right, 19% of our students transfer to a 4-year post-secondary educational institution. Now, I don't care where you're sitting, think about, is this a leading or a lagging indicator? Next slide. It's obviously a lagging indicator. It's something that we have very difficult times in influencing. Of course, we can do transfer agreements and so forth, but we really need to think through what kind of leading indicators influence this lagging indicator. Okay, next slide. Our course completion rate among Hispanic students is 62%. Now, let's pretend we're a diversity officer at our institution and we are very focused on equity as achieving the dream is. Is this a leading indicator or a lagging indicator? Next slide. It's obviously a leading indicator. So depending on where you sit, the completion rate for Hispanic students, and we mean course completion, is a leading indicator. So let's take a moment here to summarize. Let's go to the next slide. So I'd like you to think about what are your key lagging indicators at your institution. And let's run through a few of them. So traditional lagging indicators for those of us in administrative roles and those of us responding to initiatives, whether they're accountability or achieving the dream. If we look at our own indicators, what are those? Their degree certificate completion, their transfer, their whether or not a student does get a job within 2 years, but they're not things like course completion. And if we want to influence those lagging indicators, there are key leading indicators that you have control over. And those include, like Odessa found out, whether or not a student is retained in class, whether or not they complete a class, whether or not they persist. So we're arguing that with all the indicators that you have to choose from, if the institution could focus primarily on things like course retention, course success, and persistence, the lagging indicators of degree, certificate completion, and so forth will actually take care of themselves, that there doesn't need to be a significant focus on those indicators. Okay, next slide. Now what we've done is we've put together a little template to help break these out and show how they come together. So on the left side, you'll see a listing for an indicator, and we'll fill that out in just a minute. And as we move down, we break out the type of indicator, the source of where that data comes from, the frequency that that data is collected, and how it is disaggregated. By setting up a template early on, you can really articulate what do we consider leading indicators, what we have influence over, and what we consider lagging indicators. Okay, next slide. So let's take a look at a few of these. So if we're interested in the lagging indicator of completion, degree, certificate, and transfer, we know that that data primarily comes from our student information system, and we need to be collecting that data on each semester. But that data does need to be disaggregated because we're looking at our major demographic groups. We may be looking at majors as well and other demographic factors. But we're able to keep a running total, primarily through cohort analysis, of what happens to students in terms of a trend of completion, degree, certificate, and transfer. Now, if we want to focus on the leading indicators that directly influence the lagging indicators, whether or not a student earns an ABC or credit in college-level courses is critical. Because as we said before, and as Odessa College found out, without tracking this, we're simply focusing on completion, degree, certificate, and transfer, and a lot of folks are just getting upset if measures aren't going up in this area. But if we focus on improving A, B, C, and credit in college-level courses, that also leads us to interventions that focus on improving student success. And when we think about interventions in the course, for this particular leading indicator, we have things like professional development for faculty to engage. So in fact, one of the things that Odessa did, which was wonderful, is because they wanted students to stay in class and be successful, is they focused on faculty engagement to improve success rates. So what happens is leading indicators also lead you to what interventions are associated with making improvements in that area. So for earning an ABC or credit in a class, basically course success, what we found is that by training faculty on 4 areas, that is, first, they had a rigorous syllabus. I know Bill Pylan has joined us, and he will talk about Judith Gernert, and she's now O'Brien, who writes a book on the Common Core syllabus, which basically says to a student, here's everything you need to know and understand to be successful in my class. And in fact, one of the things that she recommends is that students are tested on that syllabus so that the rigor is high and students are very clear about what they're supposed to know. In addition, what Odessa did was instructors learn students' names, because there's nothing like feeling engaged when a student is called by their name in class. In addition, they used office hours, which we know tend not to be used very well, to bring in students for 15-minute appointments so that the faculty member got to know the student. It was very important that to make that connection, which they care deeply about, that faculty and students actually had discussions, not about academics, but rather who that student is, what their goals were, and so forth. And then finally, the 4th item is that, you know, we deal with populations of students that have multiple responsibilities. They have families, they have work responsibilities, and sometimes things happen. And so what the Odessa faculty agreed to do was, when a student had a really good excuse and they had gotten to know the student for not turning in work, missing an assignment, because they knew the student, they would give that student a pass and let them turn work in late. So those things happen rarely because this relationship was built. So where does this data come from in terms of earning an ABC or credit? Obviously the student information system, it's collected each semester, and of course it's broken by demographic variables and majors. In addition, they also collected, and we recommend for a leading indicator to focus on persistence. We know that students who earn successful course grades tend to persist at much higher rates than those students who earn a W, a D, or an F. And because they focused on persistence, they were very much able to track students from semester to semester and actually intervene if they weren't returning from, let's say, fall to spring or fall to fall. So that indicator gave them an impetus for action to contact students. And in fact, at Odessa College and many other colleges, they've now set up mentoring programs so that they early on know if a student is going to continue. One of the mantras that one of the colleges uses is, we know students so well, it does not come as a surprise to us that they're dropping a class. So by focusing on these leading indicators that eventually improve completion, they were able to increase, in Odessa's case, increase their completion by 55%, which was extraordinary. Next slide. So with that, I want to thank everyone for this brief introduction to leading and lagging indicators. I hope we gave you some insight as to how this works and how to focus better on what matters and what you can control. And with that, we'll open it up to a Q&A that I'll ask Lori and Allison to host.
Thanks, Brad. That was a great presentation. So at this time, we will open up the floor for questions. You can type them in directly to your question pane or raise your hand on your hand icon. I will unmute your line, and then you can speak your question to the group. Let's give it a few minutes or a few seconds to have people type in their questions, raise their hands, see if we have any just general feedback. So we have one question that came in, and I'll read it out to you, Brad. And the question is, how can one get started with using lead and lag indicators?
Thank you, Allison. One of the things that we recommend is, let's say you don't believe this matters, that leading and lagging indicators, well, look, we have to focus on graduation. We can't possibly focus on these leading indicators because we're held accountable for things like graduation. What I'd like the researchers to do is to take a look at those students that earn passing grades in their courses and compare the persistence rates with those students versus those that earn a D, F, and W. And one of the things that you'll find is a tremendous difference between students persisting from fall to spring and fall to fall if they were successful in the majority of their courses. So what we know is that success breeds success. So if we want to test this out, we can do it quite easily by simply looking at those students that were successful and their level of persistence versus those that were not successful and their level of persistence. The bottom line with leading indicators is that success breeds success. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. We have another question that has come in asking if you have any recommendations on getting consensus on establishing the leading and lagging indicators.
Yes, it's a great question because what happens is people have their own area that they care about. So one of the things to think about is, what do your current lagging indicators look like? And that is, where are you finding the most trouble? So we've been working with a number of colleges in California on student equity. And what we find is that there are a number of areas when you look at those lagging indicators that would lead to what you care about in the leading indicators. So for example, what are those areas? One would be things like basic skills sequence success, meaning are students transitioning at high enough rates who begin in developmental ed basic skills and actually move into and complete a college level course. Looking at, again, graduation and transfer rates is always a wonderful place to start as well. And we also look at things like student preparedness, meaning where are students placing on your placement exam? Are students persisting? Because again, that could be considered a lagging indicator as you're looking at leading indicators of student retention in the class and persistence. So it all begins with your data, and your Achieving the Dream data is a great place to start because you have many of these indicators already calculated. So what you're looking for is, where is the most need? The other thing to do along with these indicators is to look to see, is there a particular group that is not succeeding as well? So what we always talk to folks about is looking at differences on things like demographic variables, levels of poverty, and so forth, but also, is the overall indicator high or low? Often what people do is they move directly to the demographic variables and they look and they see differences or differential impact. But overall, the outcome may be low. In fact, one college I was just at yesterday, they have a huge persistence problem. Only about 40% of their students persist from fall to spring, and by next fall, only about 45% of them are left. So while there may be differential impacts in that persistence across race, ethnicity, gender, or age, their overall indicator of persistence is quite low. So what you need to do is just get started by looking at your data.
Great. Thanks, Brad. We had another question come in asking, in your opinion, what are the leading indicators that faculty will feel they have the greatest ability to impact?
So faculty really want students to be successful. You've heard stories of faculty saying, look, you're not going to get an A in my class and that kind of thing, but the great majority of faculty care deeply about students being successful. And they know that students are coming unprepared for their course. So one of the things to look at is student preparation and identifying very early on where students are not being successful. One of the things that faculty will tell us is that not only do they know from the very first day whether students are going to be successful, but students fall behind very quickly. And so one of the things that we work with faculty in order to better understand this is helping them understand that they need to have assessment early and often. An assessment doesn't have to be a test, and it certainly is not just a midterm and a final. That assessment needs to occur through their assignments as well. We work with NALOA on some of this work, the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. And what we learned from folks like Peter Ewell is that you have to do assessment early and often. So then what faculty care about is they need help for their students. So it's not only employing interventions such as tutoring, because many students don't want to be told they have to go to tutoring. It's just another adult telling them that they're not doing well. But rather, what you might want to consider with faculty after you've done this exercise about learning about their assessments and how students are doing and helping them understand their effect on course completion is to think about interventions such as embedding tutoring. That is, the tutor is right in the class with the faculty member. We're working with an institution right now where their entire developmental ed department has embedded tutors, and their success rates are going way up.
Thanks for that response, Brad. We have a clarification question that came in regarding the factor that rose 55% at Odessa. Could you repeat that fact? What factor was that exactly, Brad?
That was their graduation. And in fact, what was really fascinating is, Odessa said we can't focus on everything. And, West Texas has a lot of challenges, which we don't have time to talk about on this webinar. But their graduation rate was very poor. And in fact, I think the last time I talked to them, President Williams and Dr. Wood at Odessa, I think their graduation rate of late is up 70%. But what they did was by focusing on just leading indicators, which were retention and course completion, then persistence went way up. Obviously, units earned went way up. And their graduation rate within 3 years went up 55%, which is unheard of. I mean, I'd love for all of us to have those kinds of outcomes.
Thanks. Well, that concludes our discussion and question time. However, Brad's contact information is up on your screen right now, so feel free to send Brad an email directly. And as always, feel free to reach out to us. At the conclusion of this webinar, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants with the recording of this webinar, a brief evaluation, which I'll share in just a minute, and all of the presentation materials. But before we get there, I'd like to introduce our President and CEO, Karen Stout, who has joined us on the webinar.
I want to say thank you for joining us, and Brad, thank you for that great look at leading and lagging indicators and helping us to focus on the importance of leading indicators on our campuses. I think sometimes we do a lot of thinking about the end, which is, completion, and we forget all of the things along the way that we can nudge on our campuses with sometimes just small pushes, but that if we identify those leading indicators and we continue to monitor our work on those leading indicators, that they will result in moving the big needle eventually. So thank you for framing that conversation for us, and thank you for serving as a coach. And also thank you for highlighting the successes of some of the colleges in our network. The Odessa case study that you offered is a powerful one.
Thanks, Karen.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, Brad.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And if folks want to read more about this, Carl Sustein has put together a book called Nudge, just Karen, as you stated, and it talks about how as we as educators, and I'm extrapolating here, are really benevolent nudgers, and that it's important for us to understand our role and how we as educators are really helping our community, our students directly, to earn a living wage, to be a productive member of society, and the focus on leading indicators helps us understand how better we can do that. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Brad and Karen, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. In your chat frame, you'll see a brief evaluation. We'd love to hear back from you regarding this webinar, but also we'd like to hear your suggestions on future topics, content areas, or even presenters that you might know that would be a good fit for this series. So please take a minute and fill out that evaluation. We'd love to hear from you. And this concludes our webinar. We thank you so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.